was born in Lexington, Kentucky. Yep. And that's where I learned poetry. What I learned first, I learned how to complain in verse and then get like praise for it, essentially, and get good grades. You know, the first time I ever read a poem out loud, it was third grade. I was 8 years old. And so we were doing limericks that day. And I wrote my limerick about how I wanted to not do my homework, how I didn't want to do my homework, and how I wanted to play outside. And so time comes when we get the opportunity to read it in front of the class. And I read mine out loud, and there was just a silence afterward. And I wasn't sure if it was because I'd said some things that I shouldn't have said regarding the authority and the government and the homework that was being imposed on me, you know. So, but then someone goes, "That was like Shel Silverstein." And when you're in third grade, that's the extent of that's the height of poetics, you know. And so, yeah, that was a really important event for me. I've been associating with language as long as I can remember. I remember going to the grocery store and asking my mom, you know, "What is this?" And she'd say, "Sound it out." And so sound it out has really stuck with me. You know, sound it out is what poetry is all about, sounding out anything. We moved here December 14th, 1994. I still remember the day. The snow. Initially. I mean, there was just so much snow, you know? And I think the different parts of Grand Rapids, you know, Grand Rapids is such a big city that each part has its own character. So I was in Cascade, and there was a lot of woods out there. It was the first time I had almost an acre of woods in my backyard, and I played in it a lot. You know, I wrote a poem about playing in it. Yeah. And what else? I think that when you move, it's like a really disruptive thing. Your whole life, you know, you have this outlook of, this is where I'm at, this is where I started, this is all I know. And then that's changed drastically. And I think it made me write more. Yeah, that's something else that I noticed is there was less time, you know, spent outside in the winter. So I had to do something. So I'd write some poems. So I started out reading at Morningstar 75's 10 Weston Theater. The show out there was hosted by Greg Bliss, and I went there with Tyler Steinley. Tyler Steinley was a student also in Dave Cope's poetry class. The first day of class, Dave Cope said, you know, that my poetry sounded like greeting card poetry, but Tyler's he was the next shining star. So I was like, I got to make friends with this guy because I've been doing this my whole life. And now I've just had my bubble burst. This is part of my identity. And here comes this guy who studied with Allen Ginsberg, and he sounds really professional. And you know, and so he pointed that out, and it was true. It was rhyming. It was bouncing in very greeting card, you know, kind of ways. So, yeah, that was 2004, 2005. I published extensively in GRCC's Display magazine, 2004 through 2009. This is kind of a more personal highlight, but I used to work at a gas station, and I was first asked for my autograph on a poem that I wrote when I was 19. I wrote it right at the gas station, and it was about it was called Prisoners of Romance. We were learning about how not to be romantic in our literary efforts, you know, like older romantic poets. And so I wrote it in a way that I felt was like realistic, like using realism. And it was about people who would come to the gas station and, for example, one woman hacking her lungs out and then smoking still. Like, that would be a prisoner of romance because you're just entertaining this thing that isn't going anywhere. Romance within, again, the literary sense, not within the relational sense. Yeah. I started contributing writing to my grandfather for our family newsletter when I was 6 years old. And I was nominated at school for a $50 savings bond at 7 years old for a story I wrote and illustrated.
You remember the name?
I don't remember the name of it, but I remember how it goes. There's this babysitter. It's a horror story. There's a perfect for a 7-year-old, right? There's a babysitter. They're watching their kid. This woman comes 3 times and says, "Do you want to see what I can do with my fingers and my lips?" And so she comes 3 times, and then finally the babysitter, like all 3 times, the babysitter says no and like slams the door. And then the last time she says, "Okay, fine, show us what you can do." And she goes, and that's the end of the story. And it was nominated. Yeah, it was funny. It was fun. And in 8th grade, I was in the 95th percentile for math, even though I got more demerits that year for not doing my homework than any other year. I was in detention no other year except for that year. And so that year, when the teacher came to me and said, you were in the 95th percentile for math, you now get to qualify to take the SAT in 8th grade, I was like, wow, that's really great to hear. And I wasn't like, told you so, about it. So, and so that was another great thing. I got to, I got to take the SAT in 8th grade, and I was better in English than I was in math, and permitted to take a seniors only high school creative writing class as a junior because of that. And it's just, yeah. So that was what led up to college. I think that some bigger influence. Well, Joel Sweats was a great influence. The Sweats brothers were over at GRCC for a while, and I guess their dad taught over there too. So I took creative writing 1 and poetry the first semester at GRCC, and so I ended up not even doing my exam for his class, but I turned in a poem, and I turned in all these dimensions of poetry that I had thought of, and I got an A for it. Anyways, so it's good to have influences like that and teachers who understand that people have different learning styles, and let's see some other influences. Charles Simic, he was our 2007 U.S. Poet Laureate. Tyler Steinley and I really grabbed onto his poetry. Really early on, we started to read The World Doesn't End, which is his 1990 Pulitzer Prize winning collection of prose poems, and also Walking the Black Cat. It just sounds weird, Walking the Black Cat. It's not what you usually expect out of the line. You're not going to foresee that. So it's really original poetry, and it's really twisty. So we really identified with that. Tyler was a huge influence when I was coming up into poetry, because we had this very good competitive relationship that was like really, really good natured, like Paul and John, and the Beatles or something like that, just pushing each other, but like not going over the line of like too much criticism. We really enjoyed publishing back and forth. He was an editor for Display Magazine at GRCC. And so he was advocating for my poems to get published in GRCC's Display Magazine. And that was a great help to be friends with an editor at that position. Yeah. I actually got writer's block in 2005, and I got it so bad that I changed my major to fisheries and wildlife. Yeah, it was going to be creative writing all the way, and I just burnt out really fast. I also have a mental illness, and so that came to a head at that same time. And I really believe that poetry has always been there to help me with that, help me to cope with those symptoms. The power of poetry is the power of a good zinger, right? Like, I can't tell you how many times I've heard at open mics around the area, someone telling someone off, like an ex with like a series of zingers, like great one-liners, With a good enough zinger, you can open any door. I truly believe this. It's been my experience, and even something that I came to resent, because when I was still a young person as a veteran poet, having written poems since I was 8. And I was getting into doors, just talking my ways into things that I shouldn't have, simply because I can adopt an adept speaking style. You have to be careful how you use it. You know, the zinger is like a wild card. You can do anything with it, so you have to be careful. The sharper you are with your linguistics, the sharper your words you can accidentally cut yourself with. A zinger is like a wild card. You can use it to call someone out. You can use it to tell someone how you love them. You can use it to empathize. You can use it to emphasize. You can use it to create powerful social change and a good joke. And sometimes all of that at once. That's the power of poetry. I have a good anecdote about that, if you like. So this is, we were talking about, I was at GRCC. We did the 2005 spring poetry reading. Tyler also read, I believe Carl Marty was there, and they read, and several other poets, and it aired on public access. And you think, I'm in television now, and that's a big leap too. But then, Dave Cope reminded me, don't get a big head, because you get exposure like this and it's nice. But then I thought about it, and I'm like, this is a public access channel. Like, who's watching that? Everyone was watching like different channel. It's not a frequented, channel on the television. But I was working at the gas station. Here's another gas station story. And my friends started to walk up, like, chanting my poem. And chanting my poem that I had read on the public access for the spring poetry reading. And they were getting all the words wrong, though, so I wasn't exactly sure what they were doing. Like, and yeah, they came up, and they were just, what had happened was they were at a party. They were setting their PlayStation. They had to turn it to a certain channel. And when they turned it to channel, all my friends were at this party, and they all saw me. It was right at that time, like at that moment, I came on the television screen, and so they saw that. Also, I was at GRCC, and a young woman approached me and said, "You," and I was like, what have I done? And she said that she would turn it to the public access channel to fall asleep to, but she was amazed when I was on there. So that was a great compliment too. And then my therapist also saw yours truly on there. And so that was an incredibly powerful moment for me, because the poem was delivered well at the reading. So it was a great extension of me into the community. And that felt really good. I didn't know about fame and poetry, because I don't think that that's something that happens very often anyways. When I think about poetry, I think about putting it on the page more than I think about speaking out loud. And I know that there's a variety of approaches, and there's no wrong way to do it, But when I ended up, I've studied more like academically than I have with delivery and spoken word approaches, more book smarts in my poetry. I remember when I first started, I wanted to get every single word exactly in, like, the intonation correct. And you do that enough times, and you're just going to mess up at some point. And so what I learned is, at one point, I learned that it's just spaghetti at the wall, and sometimes it sticks and sometimes it doesn't, What else? I really appreciate being a quiet voice among a group of poets. A quiet voice among a group of poets. A quiet voice among a group of poets is more welcome and, like, understood in that group than in other groups. I've always been more behind the scenes than like really able to dominate on the microphone. Only recently have I begun to get better on the microphone as a result of going to church and reading scripture. Mm-hmm. That's helping with my delivery so much. It's all poetry, exactly. I don't think God cares whether we're grammatically correct in our prayers, and neither do poets in their poems. And I think that there's something to be said for that. I started to, it was more important that it sounded like common speech for me after a while when I was writing poetry. I really embraced that, and a conversational style. That's the term I was, that I was telling everyone, at the time. Greg and I go back to 2004, when I first was on the mic at the 10 Weston Theater. I was in the lightning round. I was at the very end. I was like after the lightning round, and it was a lot of people had left, and I was brand new, so I didn't have any seniority anyways. So, but then we played a song, Tyler and I did. Tyler accompanied me on acoustic guitar. I played acoustic guitar, and he asked us to open the next show. That's just like a sign of his kindness. Yeah, we don't have seniority, but this was our first show, and he's going to put me right at the front at the next show. He has done that so often for me. He, like Azizi Jasper, has spoken up for me in poetry circles and on the mic. I'm just going to digress a little bit because I want to talk about some of the people that we've talked about so far. Azizi Jasper and I read exclusively together once at Schuler Books downtown. That was a really cool reading. It was February 11th, and it was right before Valentine's Day. So naturally, Azizi totally played that up on the mic, and he was very funny, and he was very charming, and it was a great experience to get to do that with him. I got a little postcard and just treasured that, and I'm glad to give it up for the archiving. Yeah. I have not been a traveling poet. I like to be a community poet. Like I stick to my lily pad, and I treasure the lily pad. There's a scripture that Christ is a light unto our feet, or a lamp unto our feet, and it's not a big light. It's a small light, and I believe in the small light, and I believe in really staying in one place, because you just grow roots. And you grow more and more roots. And yeah, there's relationship friction. That's a part of life. But it's really, so let me see, some great moments. Third place prize for poetry in 2006, GRCC Display Magazine, adjudicated by Lyndon E. McFoster. That was my first award for poetry. I got $25. It was sweet. Third place prize. Second place for the Dire Ives in 2008. That's been a compliment that really sustained me it's been a support throughout my career to be able to say, I won second place in the student division of 2008 Dire Ives. To be recognized among the county is a really big deal. I have started actively pursuing by just finding out different, I personally am taking some classes, and just so I know what I can refer people to. And definitely, therapy works those juices so I can get it out in the poems. So mental health, and yeah, it's really important. I was on the board of directors for the Creative Youth Center from August 2020 to February of this year. And we had some amazing experiences. We were going to dissolve in May of 2020, and then some of the leadership changed, and Kate Polzin was the executive director. We became a working board which meant all of us were putting in a ton of volunteer hours. And it was, we have been going, and so it's really amazing, my time with them. One of the things that we did was we had some Zoom meetings with hybridized mathematics and creative writing. So we had some lessons that taught, if a student is good with creative writing, but they're not good with math, it makes it a little bit easier when you introduce creative writing into math, like make up your own story problems, or, like different ways to measure it. And so we ended up having a Zoom meeting with first and second graders, and then third through fifth graders, and then middle schoolers. And we presented the material to the Michigan Council of Teachers of Mathematics. And we were like rock stars. They were just cheering us on. And we made those lesson plans are still available at creativeyouthcenter.org. And what else did we do? We went to MLK Junior Park in September and October, and that was fabulous. What did we do out there? We had like different themes of like adventures. So like space or time travel. And really, I think that at one, there was like 9 kids that showed up, but mostly it was just like 1 or 2 kids. But they kept coming, this particular student, who I won't name, during our mathematics session, we're talking about how to, like, we were asking them to come up with shapes. This is a first grader. We figure circle, square, triangle, rectangular prism. And then like the next one says rectangular prism. So it's triangular prism. You got rectangular prisms in there. There was just, they were very smart kids. I love creative writing kids because they just seem like they're really good laterally thinking, from the get-go, or at least interested in it. So then we also had spooky story night at Puck's Poetry. Puck's Poetry was an open mic over at Puck's Cider Tap House, which is on Fuller next to the Cheese Lady. And they have a great artist little kind of venue that's starting up over there. I really recommend going over there. And we just had a bunch of people get up and tell scary stories. I recited Thriller deadpan, though, without like any kind of background music, and it was pretty good. This is just one man's account of the Lit Tribune. There were a lot of us. There were so many experiences that there's no way one person can wrap their head around all of it. Summer of 2009, I went to a show to see my friend Tyler Steinley play lead guitar at a bar on Bridge Street. I met Tyler in Dave Cope's poetry class. Like I said, we kind of got started there with poetry together. And Dave also lives by Quinn Davey, or lived by Quinn Davey at that time, which is really interesting because he was going to be the editor-in-chief of the Lit Tribune. Tyler read a poem during the rock show. It was sharp and loud, the room dim, and holding his electric guitar on the raised stage, it was nothing short of inspiring. After it was over, I was leaning against the wall and struck up a conversation with Josh Weston. Josh is the first person who introduced me to Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace, which is like a 3-pound book with like 50 pages of footnotes. It's very wild. Yep. We were both friends with Tyler. We talked about his poem. It came up that we were both writers and that I should meet his friends who were also writers and having a party that night. So we went to the BP gas station in Easttown to get cigarettes in Andy House's white minivan, the kind of like the type of model from the 1990s. The seats in the van were out because Pedals Ring the Bell had just played a gig. Pedals Ring the Bell was the band with frontman Shane Tripp that basically provided the soundtrack for the Lit Tribune, comprised largely of musically and linguistically adept alternative rock, and when Shane was playing by himself, mellow acoustic folk. So we got there, and it was a strange house. It's 738 Lake Drive. It looks really small, but it's actually really long. So there was a ton of people partying in there, singing a combination of rap songs and indie rock songs, and I would get to know all of those people very, very deeply. They invited me to their workshop there, and I was, happy to come. And something I want to say about writing and workshops real quick. How amazing is it when people come together and share interpersonal, real feelings and thoughts about stoning poetry? How much more amazing is it then when people come together and react just as personally and powerfully over complete gobbledygook? Like, that's the power of an open mic, isn't it? And that's the power of a writer's workshop. They came from Kalamazoo. They were selling issues at Michigan News Agency there. And again, this is just my experience with them. So during the workshops, we workshopped songs, an illustrated book, tons of poetry, and fiction with long meandering footnotes, a la David Foster Wallace from Josh Weston. He had a really great way of emulating his style. Tyler attended once, Tyler Steinley, and even Marcel attended one of their workshops. So around that time, Quinn and I went downtown for a writer's workshop in a very small room at the back of Heartside Ministries. We were given a ride back to someone's house that day by Sarah Scott, who was the art director at the Heartside Gallery and Studio, who I would get to know better when I started making art there in 2011. The Heartside Gallery and Studio is a long, thin room with lots of folk art hanging all over the walls and long, thin white plastic tables with a myriad of colors of paint splashed all over the place. Carl Marty made art there sometimes, who I'd also seen at GRCC and the 10 Weston Theater. That was also the first time that I'd heard of the Grand Rapids Creative Youth Center was in a ride there. It was in the ride back home. Sparrows is a coffee shop that boasts a wide variety of literary offerings. Most notably for me was the newsstand with lots of artsy periodicals, lots of cool artwork on the walls like you might see in some illustrated children's books. And 2 big windows in the front, outdoor seating to the front and side, and a room in the back with a big couch. So after he was done working, we would go in a small building behind the Sparrows and hang out with Dan Climby, who headed the business side of things. So we would just hang out there discussing ideas for the magazine and low light smoking and sharing poetry, some of it our own. So also the third time I ever went to a workshop, hung out with, I'm going to probably get the last name wrong, Mandy Mikkelsen, who was at that time Mandy Krevling. We went out to Circle Pines, a campground with sandy soil, lots of pine trees, and a lake with a sizable little island on it that we swam to in the middle of the night. It was wild. And I think all of Petals Ring the Bell was there, and that was the first time I got to meet them. The second time I ever met Nick Nordier. How did you say Nordier? Okay, I'm not sure what he goes by now because he went to Nortier for a while. Nordier, okay. The second time I ever met Nick Nordier, he wrote a rap for me. He called it Neil Nathaniel Kaufman.
That's just how.
Yeah, because I was reading a poem called My Name is Neil Nathaniel around literary life and later Art Prize 2010. Yeah, so one of the first times also that I was with Quinn and Dan, we were at a bonfire. It was in the backyard of a friend of theirs at night, just a bunch of literary guys, because at that time, Quinn identified as Ben and he, him, his. We were just smoking cigarettes, some drinking. We read our original poetry in a big room with lots of wooden furniture in a guest house all throughout the night and into the early morning, taking a break at one point to go swimming in the lake by there. So what I'm trying to impress is that these people got to be very personally and professionally close at the same time very quickly in my life. We continued to workshop and occasionally fundraise through house parties in East Town locales throughout the winter. We moved to 110 Fuller Southeast. That became the Litchfield headquarters, right next door to the Beer Horse. The Beer Horse acquired some local attention in 2010 for having chickens in their backyard, which some people thought should have been prohibited. They would also be big-time collaborators with us during Art Prize of 2010. Everyone moved out of the Lake Drive house, and Shane Tripp bought his first house on Fountain Street, right behind the Fulton Street Farmers Market. So we were getting a lot of momentum, starting to do these workshops and getting to know who we were as artists and as young people, because we were only like 23, 25 around that time. And we really bonded, and, where one would fall, someone would catch us. And when you have that kind of support with your friends and with artists, great things can happen. Dan, Quinn, and I met at the Meanwhile with a man named Jesse. I forget his last name. He had a multimedia company, and he wanted to do a Lit Tribune documentary. At the headquarters, we started to hang these little camera balls around, which has small holes in them, and just like where we would hang out. It felt a little weird, to have like these little. There could be a camera in here at some point, but we were odd ourselves, and we were adaptable artists, so we embraced it. The documentary never went through. We never added cameras to the house, so it didn't matter. Though we entertained the idea, I think all the way until the end of the publication. We started to do more fundraising during the summer via house shows. Started an artist workshop with Allie Mills leading it, and I became a workshop leader for the first time, also having become well versed in their Lit Tribune workshop style. Lots of bonfires over the summer. We read Allen Ginsberg's Howl, and Dan Climby took the cake. Greg Bliss was there also, and he did a great job. And we started to eat dinner and meet with the neighbors, the Beer Horse, every Sunday to plan the 2010 Art Prize Collective Plan B Town. And the Beer Horse house is wonderful. They had tons of kids. They had like words that were taped to things so the kids could learn the words for like window on a window or chair on a chair on construction paper. And there's the Wonder Wagon of Art Prize 2009, which is like a big wooden wagon with lots of art on the outside and lots of art on the inside. And you can probably Google it and find it. So I'd seen a lot of their posters around the library. I'd heard about them from the Lit Tribune. And I think it was because of the pandemic, I needed a social outlet. And I reached out. I submitted a volunteer application. I got a call from Kate Polzin, and we talked about, what was your experience with the Lit Tribune? Oh, what was your experience with Reb Roberts, who's a huge artist and who I had listed as an influence and so like a sometime collaborator in my application. So she asked me right then, like, are you interested in being on the board of directors? And I was just like, that's fabulous. I had never envisioned, this is my first board of directors that I've ever been on. That was really interesting conversation. And they got all these apps, all these communication apps that are really good. And I'd never done this. I didn't get a smartphone until 2019. And I only got it so I could get M-Perks. But I had it, so I started to do all their, like, we had Slack, we had Miro, we had all these different like things, and it was kind of a learning curve to me. I remember during that time, they had a bunch of Facebook videos that had been put up, and they put out a book of explosions every year is what they call it, is the Book of Explosions. There's one time I was walking home from the hookah lounge, and it was about 11:15 at night. I was walking to downtown to the Ferguson Apartments where I lived, and there was a guy who pulled by me in his white sedan, and I'm walking down Lake Drive, and he parks in the veterinary clinic, and he gets out of his car, and he says, hey, I have something to tell you. And I was like, it's 11:15 at night. I'm not going to talk right now. So I said, no, thanks. And he goes, it was about poetry. Like, that was power in poetry. It It was hilarious. It was a memorable event. I wrote a chapbook that helped a friend through the mental hospital. That was huge. You know, like, I feel like in Grand Rapids, there's enough of a literary scene where if people work on their poetry long enough and revise it and really take to the craft, eventually you're going to write a poem that's someone's going to say to you, that poem changed my life. That can't happen in every city.
That's very true.
Yeah. Yeah. I connected a nursing student who was, so I lived downtown in the Ferguson Apartments. You had to be disabled and homeless to qualify to live there. And so I lived there, and 70% of 70% of the people who lived there had a mental illness of some kind. So Grand Valley State University would bring their nursing students in for clinical rotations there, and which was awesome. They were great to interact with. Definitely some life into that place that we needed. And so I had written a book called S. It was the first book that I ever released. It was a book that I released with my own publishing company, Eora. Eora published me and Patrick Revere. I wanted to prove that I could have a publishing company. And
Is it still active?
no, I just wanted to prove that I could do it. So we had a book release. I'll get to that in a second. But this nursing student ended up coming to me and said, that's the first time I ever connected to literature, was your book. Yeah. And I mean, that can only happen because there's a literary community that fosters how we grow, you know, as poets in this community. We're really privileged. I sold $250 worth of a chapbook one time, and I told my psychiatrist about that, and she said I had special powers. Now that is a rare event for a psychiatrist to tell a mental health patient you have special powers. There's got to be some like serious trust there and understanding that, you know, that doesn't mean you can go fly now, you know, or I'm just saying about myself. I'm not trying to comment on anyone else's mental health scenarios. Why poetry? It allows me to walk through more walls than any other occupation. Poets are so rare that people don't know how to regard us professionally, say as a doctor or engineer talking to a poet. Yeah. Which is actually the source of poetic license. Non-poets not knowing what to expect of a poet is the source of poetic license, at least one way. I've learned quite a lot about poetry, so I wanted it to be very imagist, like lots of images in it. I wanted it to be as few words as possible, because that's another thing that David Cope taught, to just cut out the fat from the poetry. Pictures of Storms also was about poetry. Storms come in our lives, but even going into a poem feels like going into a storm for me, and I love coming out the other side. Pictures of storms. Pictures of storms inspire awe. Observing still lightning that sizzled and cut without hearing the resulting thunder, a la photography, is like watching a silent black and white movie. The elements that are missing lend intrigue. It's hard to take one shot of a storm and really capture it all. It can be very small, but when you're in the middle with no break in the clouds, the sky seems like the limit in estimating its size. The eye of a hurricane doesn't match its exterior whatsoever. From a safe distance, you can infer what it's like inside, but it's not the same as having hard evidence of flying up the funnel of a tornado. Additionally, storms can change drastically in minutes. A picture of only one of those minutes does unjust portrayal. And let's not forget, cheap cameras with shaky hands often capture a fuller story. Unanticipated amateur shooting from dangerously close proximities takes our breath away, as we've seen here on video, not only the physical, but also the emotional storm of those caught up in it, cheering for survivors. Our hearts breaking if not everyone or only the film survives. Pictures of storms are incomplete without going through and coming out the other side, camera blazing all the while. Everyone has at least one poem or a quote from a poem that means a lot to them, but very few claim to know a lot about poetry or to be experts. Non-poets like to know published poets. It's like knowing a spirit guide or a non-playable character. We help people to what is poetic. It's a legitimate service. For a while, I wanted to be a poet because I wanted to be good at something that no one else could teach me how to do. So many people say that poetry is subjective, but there are poems out there that most people or everyone agrees are good. I wanted to write those kinds of poems. So when my bubble got burst at the first day of creative writing, it was a serious thing. If we get to know each other, I will reach you with poetry before I'm done knowing you. As a poet, I gravitate to find what's poetic about you. A role that takes as much license as a therapist with their client, a surgeon with an instrument, an ornithologist cradling a hurt baby bird. The stakes are just as high, the promise of what could come is just as real. The license is poetic license, a license that flies under the radar of all but those who seek it earnestly. In Grand Rapids, I wanted to talk about electric poetry, started by Deidre, who's no longer with us, I believe. Electric poetry was another thing like the diatribes that really helped to boost my ego and my self-esteem. So I know that they were going as Olive at that time, and then it was later taken over by Kelsey May, and I believe Katie Herr was helping with it for a while. It's just great to have something on the radio every Tuesday at 10:15. She was a powerful presence. The first time I ever went to Flow, which was a open mic at Wealthy Street Theater, she was there and she was like, anyone can read poetry on here. Come read poetry. She picked me up in her car and then we drove to like WYCE. She's very nice, just very humble, just very supportive of the arts in Grand Rapids. Let's see. Oh, I wanted to mention my fun fact. My birthday is the first day of National Poetry Month. Fountain Street Church has been helpful. They did the ekphrastic poetry, which is poetry based on art, and I was in that several times. Let's see. Reb Roberts has been very, very supportive of my poetry. The first time I ever read a poem for Reb, the first time I ever read a poem the first time I ever showed a poem to Reb, he wanted to plaster it full size in the Vertigo music windows. That's a huge compliment, but I wasn't that bold. So he sends me over to Herm at Vertigo and he calls after me, tell Herm I got the big paper, and I'm just like, this is hilarious. This is so comical. And I went to Herm and said, hey, how would you think about me putting some poetry in your shop window? Maybe just a small thing. And he's like, yeah, absolutely. So we did the Poet's Door there. I designed a cabinet door in Reb's workshop, collaborating, like drawing from his style. And then I went to lunch and he had made a sign on it that said the Poet's Door. And we hung it up in August, I want to say August of 2013 or 2014. And I was walking by one morning and there was a person who had just come out of Guiding Light Mission and they took their time to stop and read the poem. So, yeah, it's like there aren't enough tentacles of poetry throughout the city. There's just so many. And it's just growing more and more.